Hi, I'm Gary, and this is EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking back at a few things I've learned over the last 5 years of doing this podcast and what that means to EV drivers. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Zap Map, the free-to-download app that helps EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. Now, before we start, I wanted to apologise for the lack of an EV insurance episode this season. I know I promised it last week, but we had a number of logistics and other issues with putting the episode together. Sometimes the PR company work with you and add value, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes the company itself adds value, and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, none of the stars aligned, so we booted that episode to next season. Stay tuned for that, and if you don't subscribe, why not do so now so you don't miss anything? Our main topic of discussion today is learnings, reflection, and a little bit of nostalgia. Now, I've been doing this podcast now since 2019, which is not long after I got my first electric vehicle. And in that time, many things have changed. The number of EVs on the road has changed. The number of the types of EVs you can buy has changed. The price of EVs has changed. The charging infrastructure has changed. The price of charging has changed. The amount of misinformation about EVs has changed. And the government has changed. And I'd like to think I've been a party to quite a lot of those changes and might even have helped push some of them forward in some small way. Now, on this show, we've spoken to many Chargepoint operators, including two this season, Smart Charge and BEV. And I tend to ask them all a similar sort of set of questions, and that way I can compare and contrast the answers to see which companies are focused on rolling out infrastructure, which is focused on the company, and which are focused on rolling out infrastructure that's focused on profits. And by profits, I mean focusing on getting the best and quickest return on investment to pay off their capital. Now, remember, all the big Chargepoint operators have invested huge sums in public charging. At the time of writing, there's a commitment of almost £6 billion to increase the charging infrastructure. But it wasn't always this way. Back when I first started the podcast, there were a relatively small number of operators who were doing their best to provide charging infrastructure. And what's interesting is comparing and contrasting the different approaches to their solutions. Genie Point, for example, went for a single charger, 50 kilowatt, usually in a Morrison's car park. They made a bad choice of hardware supplier, and Dee Humphries, ex-CEO of Genie Point, said so on this very podcast, and reliability suffered. Osprey Charging, or as they were known then, Engenie, usually went for dual chargers in car parks to start with. They had better, more reliable hardware. Polar, or ChargeMaster, were outliers. They were the largest rapid charge network at the time, but their rollout strategy seemed to be single 50 kilowatt chargers in as many places as possible. Usually these were places like Holiday Inn hotels or pub car parks. They weren't focused on accessibility of chargers or ease of use or even reliability. For a couple of years, they were able to stay ahead of the curve. I mean, they were my go-to CPO for a while. Then they were brought out by BP Pulse and, well, let's just say things weren't quite the same. Up north of the border, there was Charge Place Scotland, a government-funded organisation installing chargers and providing free charging for Scottish EV drivers, alongside a government-provided interest-free loan for people to buy second-hand EVs. The main, i.e. most visible Chargepoint operator, would have been Ecotricity at the time. They contracted with every motorway service in the service area in the country, more or less, to add either one or two rapid chargers in the car parks there. At the time, these were just 50 kilowatt chargers, and many of them were just CHAdeMO and AC only. Remember back then, the main EVs that you could buy in the UK were the Nissan Leaf and the Renault Zoe. One charged via CHAdeMO and the other charged via AC. Yeah, 43 kilowatt AC, but it was AC nonetheless. Now, of course, looming over all of this was Tesla, who had their own proprietary charging hardware network with the superchargers. But over time, things started to change. For a start, the number of CPOs who were putting hardware in the ground exploded. At the last check of Zap Map, we now have something in the region of 70 CPOs in the UK alone, not to mention dozens of others that are searchable in Europe via the app. What also happened was that the quality of these networks started to become a little bit more defined, both good and bad. People started to have their own favourite networks. There were those who would only go and charge at places like InstaVolt or Osprey Charging. There were those who would never use a Genie Point or a Shell recharge unit. In fact, on this very show, Steph Weller, full-time wheelchair user and EV driver, said, Shell Recharge are the network you use to get you to the charger you want to use. Now, Ecotricity expanded their offering to include CCS charging. This opened them up for use by cars such as the BMW i3 and the Jaguar I-Pace. Unfortunately, that wasn't without its difficulty, as the CCS standard wasn't, and still isn't, as robust a standard as CHAdeMO. And we'll come back to this a little later. As battery electrochemist Dr. Ewan McTurk said,
I believe that the wrong format is winning. CCS is being foisted upon us despite the fact that it's not currently able to do vehicle-to-grid charging, and despite the fact that the protocol is so loosely defined that you've seen the likes of the Jaguar I-Pace and even Teslas having compatibility issues with older charge points. This is because, unlike CHAdeMO that is rigorously defined, CCS is kind of like they've given you the ingredients to make a cake, but not the recipe.
As a result of this, several cars found that they were unable to actually charge on the Ecotricity CCS units. This was resolved over time, but it did leave something of a bitter taste in some people's mouths. To add insult to injury, the payment processing was a little lackadaisical, shall we say. Most Chargepoint operators wanted you to download an app to use their units. This included BP Pulse and Ecotricity. The only one that didn't back then was InstaVolt, who had managed to find the sweet spot of being ultra-reliable, contactless only, and reasonably priced, although, unfortunately, that didn't last. As a result, many EV drivers found themselves having a phone full of apps, or, in the hardwired version of that, a glove box full of RFID cards. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a good RFID card as much as the next man, but needing a different one for each Chargepoint operator was a little ridiculous. The other major change that's happened in the last few years is the increase in the number of charge points actually in the ground. The last 2 years in particular have seen increases of 40% plus year on year. Now, this obviously isn't going to last, but it does mean that the chargers are being put in, the units are being installed, and the network is growing. We recently hit a major milestone of 100,000 connectors available on the public network, and that's not including workplace chargers and home chargers. But for me, a key figure to watch out for is 8,200. Why? Very easily, very simple. Once we can say that we have 8,200 ultra-rapid charging locations in the UK, we can now say that there are more places to rapidly charge your car than there is to fill an internal combustion engine vehicle, with a target audience that is currently less than about a tenth of its size. Now, at the time of writing, we're a little under 5,900 ultra-rapid chargers, and it's increasing at a rate of around 250 per month. On that trajectory, we should be there in about 10 months' time, but I'll give it until the end of 2025 as a bit of leeway. Of course, those figures hide a load of subtleties. London has by far the largest number of charge points in the country, but it also has the largest number of vehicles there. And don't listen to these silly articles that tell you that Stockport is the highest number of registered EVs. That's the headquarters of one of the largest vehicle financing companies in the country. So, of course, the cars are going to be registered there. That's not where the cars are actually being used. Now, if you want an indication of where vehicles actually are, it's worth going to the EVA England website and clicking on the link for their EV constituency map. This allows you to click your local area and find out both how many EVs are registered there, alongside how many chargers are available. Now, I want to move on a little to the cars themselves. Back in the day, the two main non-Tesla cars you could get were the Renault Zoe and the Nissan Leaf. A little later on, BMW broke through with their fantastic i3, followed by Jaguar with the I-Pace and Kia with the Soul, which was a compliance car for the US market. And that was pretty much it for quite a while. These were expensive, fairly hard to come by, especially during lockdown, and the numbers on the road crept up, albeit slowly. Now, to discuss this and sort of reiterate a few of the things I've talked about, I want to bring Alex Lowe onto the chat.
My name's Alex Lowe, and I run the website and various YouTube channels under the umbrella of The Interface. the website of which I've been running since 2013. I do various car reviews on YouTube as well.
Talk to me briefly about the original market for EVs in the UK. What were the main ones you could buy and which were the game changers?
If we're talking back ages ago, like the 2011 sort of stuff, there wasn't really many, was there? We had the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, which I think everyone remembers Robert Llewellyn's reviews of that car when it came out. I remember actually watching a Grand Designs episode back in that sort of era, and someone on the episode had a Mitsubishi i-MiEV, and they were haloed as this sort of very forward-looking family. But we look back on that time now, it's just like the first smartphone, or not even that, just the first phone, like a Nokia phone, in terms of where we've come since then. You had things like the Nissan Leaf, obviously, which everyone knows, and there's still a lot of them hanging around now. That's about it, really.
We had Quentin Wilson on the show recently, and he likes to tell the story of, because he and Robert Llewellyn picked up the i-MiEVs on the same day at the same time. And they picked them up from somewhere in the Midlands, and Quentin drove his home. He lives around the Stratford-on-Avon thing. And he basically, he put the foot down going down the motorway, and he ran out of charge and ended up having to knock on the door of some lady on the side of the street and just say, sorry, I've got one of these new electric vehicles. Do you mind if I plug in at your house for a little while? And she went, oh no, come in, Chris. So she served him tea and coffee, and he basically had to sit there and chat with her for 3 or 4 hours while he got just enough charge so he can get back home. So absolutely fascinating. I love that story. If we move on a little bit from the i-MiEVs and the Leaf, what were the main ones that came on that made people kind of stand up and go, oh, actually, these EVs might be something? I'm not talking 2020. I'm talking sort of between 2011 and 2020.
I think around 2013 time, we had the Model S come in. And I know that was a very expensive car when it came in, and not many people could afford them and stuff. But that really, when you look back at what specs it actually had really, really forward-looking specs at that time. I mean, I think it had over 250 miles of range and quite fast charging as well. It's incredible to look at that. Around that time, I think in the US, Ford had the Ford Focus Electric, but that never made its way here. That was quite an early sort of experiment for them, and things like that really. And I think at that time, it started to become a bit more serious for some of the manufacturers. It wasn't just this one-off experiment that they were going to do. It was a bit more, we should probably do something with this. And we're still looking at that now in 2024, really, which is quite funny. But
what Tesla did is they proved that you could come in and produce more or less a mass market electric vehicle with good specs, and it would sell.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, they were able to sell every single one that they made. And I believe there may even have been a short waiting list at certain points to get that. Talk to me about the i3, the BMW i3.
I remember watching a documentary about that because it was very, very advanced in terms of its production and design, because it was all carbon fiber, which was really advanced. And there were obviously different versions of it. So you had a very small electric-only version to start with, and then later on it had much more range. And they had a range extender version as well, which they dropped from the line eventually. But a very forward-looking car, and even if you look back now, it still looks modern, which is crazy because that's 2013 that came out.
They're actually really, really underrated vehicles. Simon, who co-founded the podcast with me, his first electric was an i3, and he and I did a 600-mile journey in his i3 in one day.
Wow.
For the podcast, and that's back on episode 13, 14 or something like that. So quite a way back. Absolutely faultless. Had a range of 120, maybe 130 miles if there was a lot of downhill involved. Didn't charge more than 50 kilowatts. So we did spend a little bit of time at chargers, but he always tells the story. The only problem the only thing he had about it that he disliked was because it had the suicide doors, basically. Yeah. So they both open from the center and pivot hinge on the outside. And he had a young child at the time who had to sit in the back with the child seat. And under certain circumstances, if you parked in the wrong way, when you opened the doors to get the child out, you actually blocked yourself in if there was a car parked next to you and you couldn't get out. He said it's a little infuriating. I was chatting with him recently. He said, I still look back fondly on the i3. He said, but those doors, not good at all. Not good at all. So what do we think was the next leap after that? So we've got the Leaf. I mean, we've kind of conveniently glossed over the Zoe. Do you want to talk about the Zoe for a while?
The original Zoe was, I think that was Renault's first, along with the Twizy at the same time, but that was Renault's first foray into the electric world. Even a few years ago, I'm still seeing a common thread with this now is I'm still seeing quite a few of them around. One thing with that one, which was really strange, is that they did the battery lease program, which thankfully with the second one they removed, because it even now, if you try and buy one from the first year or two when it came out, you still got to sort of deal with the lease. And I don't really know the consequences if you don't pay for that lease. You get some angry man coming to your door. But
it was interesting with the Zoe because it basically had two things that were going against it and two things that were going for it. One is it was relatively cheap in the big scheme of things, and two is it had quite a reasonable range for such a small car.
Yeah.
The two things that were going against it was, as you say, there was the battery leasing, and the other issue that it had was it was AC charging only. And that was something that was consistent across the Renault range at the time, the different Zoes that they had, until they got to the most up-to-date one, the ZE50, which was the first one that had CCS. Now, the plus side to that is that all the Renault Zoes charged reasonably quickly under AC. They had 43 kilowatt AC charging, which is quite good in the big scheme of things. I mean, you know, my first electric was the Kia Soul, and you know there were times when it wouldn't even charge 43 kilowatts DC, you know, and here they were, Renault with a 43 kilowatt AC. But what that also did was that's now carried over onto some of the more modern ones, which we'll talk about next season, with things like the Megane, where, I mean, obviously it's got DC charging, but it will also charge really, really quickly. You plug it into an AC charger and it will go straight up to 22 kilowatt AC charging, which not many vehicles will at the moment. So that's good. So what did we have after the Zoe? What was the next kind of one that came in that everyone went,
So the Jaguar I-Pace, that really, considering all the conversation about Jaguar at the moment, Jaguar really doesn't have much budget to develop new cars, really, in the general scheme of things, compared to bigger German car manufacturers. For that sort of company to build a brand new EV ground up is pretty impressive, really. Yeah, and there seems to be quite a big, at the moment, there seems to be quite a big following of that car, because it is quite impressive. I've never driven one, but from what I've heard, it is quite impressive.
I've ridden in one. Gary Whittaker, friend of the podcast, actually came on and talked about his I-Pace, took me out for a ride in it. Very, very, I mean, lovely inside, just as you'd expect from a Jaguar. Very, very nice fit and finish on it. Very powerful. It's almost like a cult car. The people who like it really, really like it. But it did have a couple of issues, because one of the other things that we'll talk about on the podcast is the way the charging infrastructure has sort of increased. And one of the key things on that was Ecotricity, who originally were AC and CHAdeMO. And then when they put the DC charging onto their Ecotricity chargers at the motorway service areas, the I-Pace was one of those that always tended to have handshake issues. So if you had an I-Pace and you tried to charge at a motorway service area, there was a very good chance that it would kind of go, no, really don't want to do that. And you might have to try 2 or 3 times, or you might just end up not being able to charge at all. Now, yes, they've changed that now. They've updated it, and it tends to work everywhere. But that was one of the dings that went against the I-Pace. Was there any other key milestone in terms of the electric vehicles that came on the market?
So I'm just thinking we're probably at the 2017, 18 years. So VW is still a few years away.
I mean, I've got to put the hand up for my personal favourite and a much underrated, the Kia Soul.
Of course, that was at that time.
Interesting vehicle, a compliance vehicle. So it was one that was created by Kia to allow them to sell into the California market so that they could meet the CARB, the Clean Air something or other bureau in California. It was to meet their requirements. The phrase I'm looking for here is the California Air Resources Board. So it was basically a petrol car that they literally took all the petrol stuff out and put a motor and a battery in. And ugly as sin, as the saying goes, had a face only a mother could love. But extremely underrated as a vehicle. I drove one for 4 years, and 105, 110 miles range, maybe 120 if it was nice and warm, but ultra reliable, lots of room inside. The software was good, the software worked. Severely underrated as a vehicle. Which kind of brings us on to the Korean market. So when do we think, or do we know when the first lot of Korean ones came on, the e-Niro, for example?
That was around, must be 2018, 2019. Was that about right?
I believe so.
Yeah, but it's incredible because the Korean car market has sort of, the last 20 years, has just sort of blossomed, because I I'm quite a big fan of Top Gear. And there was an episode in like 2003 where James and Jeremy looked at the Korean car market and just ripped into it because they were all rubbish. And they were sort of really, really cheap, horrible cars. And we're 20 years on and the Koreans are doing incredible work with anything they're doing, and especially EVs. It's incredible to watch.
One of the things that they did, which was revolutionary at the time, and I think it's still not adopted by a lot of OEMs, is they gave the 7-year warranty on the vehicle. I mean, yeah, most OEMs will give a 7 or 8 year warranty on a battery now for an electric vehicle, but Kia / Hyundai gave the 7-year warranty for the whole lot, which gave a lot of people a lot of confidence to actually go in and buy one. But so what do we know about the e-Niro? You've driven the e-Niro, the original one?
I've not driven the e-Niro. No. I know Andrew Till has one of those. I guess he's a friend of the show. Yes. But yeah, he has one of those and he loves it. And I've heard they're very good. So at some point I need to drive an original e-Niro.
Warren Phillips, chair of EVA England, is also a huge fan of the e-Niro. I was chatting with him the other day. And we were in the Ioniq 5N at the time, which is my all-time favourite electric vehicle at the moment, and it's his. And I said to him, are you going to get one of these? And he said, I might do. He said, but I really, really love the e-Niro that I've got. You know, it does everything I need. It's comfortable. The software works. And it's got a huge range. You can get, you know, on a good day with the right weather, you can get 300 miles out of that. And for a car that's 5 years old, maybe 6 years old now, absolutely unbelievable. Now, I'm also covering misinformation in this episode. Talk to me a little bit about your impression of what's happening in the EV transition from a misinformation point of view. And particularly, what were the original tropes that people would trot out back in 2016, 2018 versus kind of where they are at the moment?
I think the original things that people would be concerned about is would it do enough miles for them, which is still a little bit of a concern. And then also, you're just powering it off the grid, which is dirty. That was one of the concerns, which isn't really a concern anymore, much anyway.
What I find interesting about that is that wasn't necessarily misinformation at the time. I mean, there was a genuine concern that you would run out of charge, because at the time, if you discount Tesla, 100 miles, I mean, even on some of the 24 kilowatt hour Leafs, 60 miles, 80 miles, there was a genuine concern. Plus the, you know, powering it off a dirty grid. Yeah, it wasn't quite as dirty as people thought, but it was it's a genuine concern. Yeah, you're taking the pollution from the tailpipe and you're moving it to a power station somewhere. And I think the key difference now is when you come to what we're hearing today, specifically, you know, as we're recording this, they've just announced the closure of the closure of the Vauxhall plant at Luton. And of course, that's all, it's EV related. And they're trotting out all the old tropes, none of which are true anymore, and a lot of which are deliberate misinformation. And I think that's a key thing that's changed in the years since then. You know, we've gone from this is a genuine issue and it needs to be addressed to this is something I'm effectively making up to try and slow down the transition. And it's a big issue. We've got to do something about it.
I think also, if we look back to like 2011, 2012, the people, there were a handful of people interested in EVs. So the wider public they either didn't hear about it or just like, it's fine. Like, but now it's becoming a very stark part of reality that it's affecting more people, I guess, in terms of the wider public perception in that terms of things. So
I want to wrap this up. Any final thoughts, Alex?
It's definitely interesting to see what's going on at the moment, like the progress that's been made, and all the other car companies sort of like struggling to compete with China a little bit. And it is, for all the naysayers out there, you have to be optimistic, which really, really helps. And it's just interesting to watch. Yeah. That's my main takeaway from what's happening at the moment.
Of course, we can't talk about progress in the EV world without talking about the Public Charge Point Regulations 2023. These are a set of standards and rules backed up by penalties which came into place last year. They covered a number of different aspects which I covered in more detail on an episode I did around the time they launched. These are, I think, key when it comes to public confidence in charging. They cover items such as reliability, payment processing and payment transparency, roaming, and open data. None of these things were around when I started driving EVs. Each one of them is like a small stepping stone in building public confidence in charging. Now, we discussed payment transparency in the payments episode with Sarah Sloman recently, episode 228. It's important that people know in advance how much it's likely to cost for their charging, whether it's a higher price for some of the ultra-rapid Chargepoint operators or a more reasonable price for the likes of AC charging with Chargy. Now, roaming is a big one for me, though. Now, I said it several times on this show, I don't care that there are numerous roaming operators. For me, the more the merrier. What I want, though, is, regardless of which roaming operator I use, that it can roam across all CPOs in an area. Within reason, obviously. There are about 70 CPOs in the UK at the moment. I'm looking for consistency among the top 10 or 15 major ones. So far, nobody has achieved that. I mean, who roams with GridServe, for example, or BP Pulse? Well, actually, GridServe are linked with the Plug Surfing app, it seems. Do we know anyone who uses that app in the UK? And as for BP Pulse, well, moving on. One thing I've seen at a macro level, which is very encouraging, is the increase in people who are starting to look at EV ownership alongside energy generation and the whole energy production equation. They say that owning an EV is a gateway drug to bigger things, and it certainly was in my case. When you realize that you can power your car from things like solar panels, or that owning an EV gives you access to time of day tariffs, which can cut the price of electricity to your car and even your whole house, you then start to consider the bigger energy picture. Many new EVs have what's called vehicle-to-load facilities, and this can be useful when looking at alternate ways to power things around the house. A friend of the podcast, Andrew Till, who we've already mentioned, was able to pull energy from the battery of his Ioniq 5 when they had a power cut, and he could keep the fridge, TV, and Wi-Fi router going. Router? Hey, tomato. There are also companies like 3TI who are looking at using energy from batteries in cars they're charging to help balance the grid. Their Papilio 3 install can link multiple CCS rapid chargers to vehicles and the grid and facilitate energy both ways to both reduce costs and charge cars at the same time. In fact, there are buildings in Utrecht, Holland that are run almost 100% from vehicle-to-grid energy pulled from cars connected to the building. Octopus Energy, who we've mentioned numerous times on the podcast, also have taken this a step further with their Octopus Zero Bills offering. If you're living in a new build house kitted out with the right combination of solar panels, home battery, and heat pump, this tariff will allow you 0 bills for the first 5 years, guaranteed. All this is something which has increased or come into play over the last 5 or so years. But I couldn't do a reflections episode without addressing the elephant in the room when it comes to EV adoption: misinformation. The nature of this has moved on since I got my first EV in 2018. Back then, misinformation wasn't as much of an issue, although there were potential legitimate things that people could highlight in their fight against EVs. Range anxiety was a thing. I mean, the Nissan Leaf, the Kia Soul, and the BMW i3 all topped out around 100 miles, maybe a little bit more on a good day. There were huge areas of the country with minimal to no charging infrastructure, and the vehicles were, relatively speaking, incredibly expensive for what they were. And these aspects and more were covered in the very first episode of this podcast, Myths and Legends. But since then, misinformation has become a lot more insidious. Paltering, the selective use of truths to mislead, alongside mainstream media printing one-sided, inaccurate, and uninformed pieces about EVs, have also become rife. When it comes to misleading articles, I always tend to quote the same example. Usually, it's written by a journalist who's never driven an EV before, and indeed might not even be a motoring journalist. Could be a restaurant critic. No names, no pack drill. Somebody who picked an EV up in London on a Friday night with usually less than a full charge, and then attempts to have a weekend away in Scotland with no preparation. And naturally, it's going to go wrong. In much the same way that when I first handed an iPhone to my elderly mother, she found it difficult to use and wanted to go back to her old dumb phone. Does that mean it was the wrong choice to go to smartphones? Absolutely not. It meant there was a learning curve, as there is with most new things. Do you think people who drove horses and buggies all their lives could get into a Model T and instantly know how it all worked? No, absolutely not. The likes of Quentin Wilson, Colin Walker, Lorna McAteer, and the aforementioned Dr. Ewan McTurk, all former guests of the podcast, have joined forces with the Fully Charged team to create Stop Burning Stuff, which is focused on misinformation in the media. And this has morphed into being part of Electric Vehicles UK, a body focused on improving EV uptake. Together, These people and groups are working to try and reduce misinformation and allow people to make more informed choices about their EVs. Now, don't get me wrong. Whilst I would love everyone to be driving around in an EV, the fact is that there are many people for whom the move doesn't make sense at the moment. If you do lots of daily miles and you don't have home charging, it could be a challenge. If you need something that can sit 7 people, tow a 2-ton caravan and not lose too much range in the cold weather, that might be difficult. But that's why we have an adoption curve rather than a cliff edge. My interest is making sure that people who are on the adoption curve are informed enough to make the right decision based on facts, rather than listening to some of the naysayers on social media. And I think that goes for a lot of my listeners. This season, we're looking at raising the awareness of carbon literacy with our listeners, and one way we're doing that is with a carbon fact as read by carbon literacy trainer Hans Nelson.
To save money, fuel, electricity and emissions, try eco-friendly driving if you possibly can. Accelerate and brake less, and make sure that if you're driving a petrol or diesel car, you're using higher gears. Check your tyre pressure before you travel long distances, and drive at 70 on motorways rather than sneaking over the limit.
It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with you listeners. In quite a phenomenal push towards renewable energy, China has added 160 gigawatts of solar power capacity in just the first 3 quarters of 2024, bringing its total solar capacity to an impressive 770 gigawatts. That's a staggering 48% increase from the previous year. Wind power has also seen significant growth, reaching 480 gigawatts, as the nation accelerates its commitment to clean energy sources. This rapid expansion highlights China's leading role in the global transition to a more sustainable energy future. We love to see this. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by Zap Map, the go-to app for EV drivers in the UK, which helps EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. Zap Map is free to download and use, with Zap Map Premium providing enhanced features which include using Zap Map in-car, on CarPlay or Android Auto, and helping with charging costs with both a pricing filter and a 5% discount on charging. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of Dr. Ewan McTurk and Alex Lowe. Links to their respective sites are in the show notes. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Twitter or X @MusingsEV. I'm also on Instagram @EV Musings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. Why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/EVmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/EVmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks, So You've Gone Electric and So You've Gone Renewable. They're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on Amazon. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging right now as you listen, but if you can remember and you enjoyed this episode, drop me a review in iTunes, please. It really helps me out. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by tweeting me @MusingsEV with the words plus ça change. It's French, you know. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks, as always, to my co-founder Simon. You know, he loves to sit and reminisce about when he was a young kid and he could still look at the world and marvel at the things around him, unlike the old cynics we both are now. In particular, we were talking about the brand new toilets they've just installed at his workplace and how they're built on the Bauhaus principles.
I remember watching a documentary about that because it was very, very advanced in terms of its production and design, because it was all carbon fibre, which was really advanced.
Thanks for listening. Bye.